So what if the footnotes in a dense philosophy book were actually the main event? Today, we're going to uncover a pretty incredible hidden partnership, one where a philosopher didn't just quote a poet for style points, but actually used his words as the tools to build a whole new world of thought.
No, seriously, think about it. You're deep into some heavy philosophical text, and all of a sudden, there's a line of poetry. What's your first reaction? Do you just think, oh, that's nice, bit of cultural flair, just some decorative footnote? Or could it actually be the key to the whole argument?
Well, according to scholar Annelies Schulte Nordholt, for the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, it was absolutely fundamental. She argues that for him, the dark, kind of haunting poetry of Charles Baudelaire wasn't just decoration at all. No, it was essential. It was the actual language he needed to forge some of his most radical and, frankly, groundbreaking ideas.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we first need to look at Levinas's method. Because it was pretty unusual. He didn't just read poetry, he put it to work in a way that most philosophers just don't.
And here's a surprising little biographical fact that kind of explains everything. Levinas's first love, it wasn't even philosophy, it was literature. Yeah, as a teenager back in the 1920s, he was actually a poet himself, writing in Russian. And you can see how that early passion just stuck with him, giving him this incredible sensitivity to the power of language. So here's the key thing to understand about his method. He wasn't just quoting poets to illustrate a point. Not at all. He would literally weave their lines directly into the fabric of his own prose. And get this, a lot of the time he wouldn't even use quotation marks or say who he was quoting. He would actually rewrite the poem, changing it to build his own argument. It's like he was treating poetry as a tool, not just some pretty ornament. Okay, check this out. It's a perfect example of what we're talking about. The poet Rimbaud wrote this famous line, "True life is absent, we are not in the world." So what does Levinas do? He takes the first half, "True life is absent," and then he just adds his own ending. He writes, "But we are in the world." He completely flips the meaning on its head. And by doing that, he's basically picking a fight with Rimbaud's whole idea of romantic escapism. For Levinas, you can't just wish you were somewhere else. Nope. Any search for something deeper, something more, it has to start from right here, in our messy, inescapable reality. You see? The poetry isn't just an illustration, it's an active player in a philosophical argument. All right, now this method becomes absolutely critical when Levinas turns to Baudelaire. He uses it to tackle his first huge philosophical problem, which is this profound, almost suffocating feeling of being trapped inside your own self. And it turns out Baudelaire had the perfect word for this state: spleen. You might see it translated as ennui, but let's be clear, this is way more than just being bored on a rainy afternoon. We're talking about a deep existential fatigue, a weariness with existence itself. It's the feeling that you are completely imprisoned within your own self, and there is no escape. And get this, Levinas closes his magnum opus, his most famous book, Totality and Infinity, with these very lines from Baudelaire. He ends the whole thing by quoting a line about an ennui so huge it takes on the proportions of immortality. I mean, that is an unbelievably bleak way to wrap up a major work of philosophy. For Levinas, this verse is the perfect expression of what he calls the prison of subjectivity. It's this idea that the self is locked into a hard, irrevocable contract to just exist. You're condemned to be you, and you can't get out of it. And Baudelaire's poetry gives him the exact words to describe that horrible, trapped feeling. He also pulls from another one of Baudelaire's famous poems, The Voyage, to completely tear down the idea that you can just run away from this feeling. In the poem, you have these travelers who set out, just for the sake of starting. But they pretty quickly find out that the world is the same everywhere because, well, you can't escape yourself. Right, because you can't leave yourself behind. So the whole world just becomes, in Baudelaire's killing phrase, an oasis of horror in a desert of annoy. So for both of them, for Levinas and Baudelaire, this tour of the world is really nothing more than a tour of the prison of your own identity. Okay, so now we're getting into what is probably Levinas's most famous, and let's be honest, his most difficult concept. And guess what? Once again, it's Baudelaire who hands him the exact words he needs. The concept is called the il y a. It literally translates to the there is. To get a feel for it, imagine you're in a totally dark, totally silent space. Everything you know is gone. No objects, no people, not even your own thoughts. So what's left? You'd think nothing, right? But for Levinas, what's left isn't nothingness. It's this anonymous, impersonal, horrifying rustle of existence that just goes on and on. It's the raw fact that there is. So how do you even begin to talk about a dread that abstract? Well, where do you think Levinas turns? Yep, he goes right to Baudelaire's poem The Cats, and he lifts a specific phrase, l'horreur des ténèbres, the horror of darkness. That, for him, is the feeling of the il y a. And using Baudelaire's language lets him make this absolutely crucial distinction between his philosophy and that of his contemporary, Heidegger. See, for Heidegger, our basic fear is anguish, which is the fear of nothingness, the fear of death. But Levinas, armed with Baudelaire, says, no, you got it wrong. The deepest horror isn't the fear of not being. It's the fear of being forever, of being unable to stop existing. And to really drive home this horror of an existence you can't escape, Levinas uses yet another one of Baudelaire's absolutely chilling lines. Tomorrow, alas, one must live again. Just feel the weight of that for a second. That's not hope for a new day. It's the dread of a new day. And that single line just perfectly captures what Levinas calls the shudder, that moment you realize existence is irremissible. That's a fancy word, but it just means it's unforgiving and you can't get out of it. There's no exit. You are, quite simply, condemned to live. So, okay, as Schulte Nordholt shows us, Baudelaire's poetry wasn't just a small influence on Levinas's early work. It was absolutely decisive. It literally gave him the vocabulary for his darkest and most original ideas. But the story has a twist. Basically, Baudelaire became the voice for Levinas's whole first philosophy, his deep dive into the subject trapped by the crushing weight of its own being. And it's really no surprise that almost every single line Levinas borrows comes from what you might call the spleen side of Baudelaire's work, the dark, gloomy, imprisoned side. But here's the twist. Right when Levinas pivots to his most famous ethical ideas, the stuff about the face of the other, our infinite responsibility for other people, he drops Baudelaire completely. He just stops referencing him entirely. And Schulte Nordholt calls this a massive missed opportunity. And you have to wonder, right? Because Baudelaire wasn't just the poet of spleen. He also wrote these incredibly powerful, moving poems about the vulnerable people of Paris. You know, the beggars, the blind, the elderly. He was writing about the very other that would become the absolute center of Levinas's later ethics. So it leaves us with this really provocative question. What might have happened if the philosopher hadn't abandoned the poet who helped build his world? What amazing ideas were left on the table?